Hi, in this tutorial we're going to get the fuel draining from the player so that when we run out of fuel our ship no longer can thrust in any direction. And also while we're at it, we're going to go ahead and add in a couple more UI pieces for winning and losing. Let's start with those UI pieces first. So click on the canvas and we're going to create a new text object. So UI text. I'm going to switch back over to 2D mode. I'm going to scroll back so I can see the entire UI. Now we're just going really simple here. We want to just communicate to the player that they've won or lost. So you can write whatever you want in here. I'm going to make mine super big. Scale mine up to maybe 48, maybe 50. Notice that it disappeared in that blue box. So what I'm going to do, it's just what's happened is it's been oversized and it's grown outside of the size of the UI box we've created for it. You can make that bigger. I'm going to just drop it down a little bit, and then I'm going to run it all the way across until that line glows orange. Okay, so that's basically the width of my screen. And what I'm going to do is down here on the text object, I'm going to center that, and I'm going to center it also there as well. Let's make that a little. Okay, and let's make it green. Again, you can do whatever you like with yours. And let's give it a good name that will remember what it is. Yeah. So once you have that created with that When UI object selected, hit your Control C and then Control V. Just duplicate that. This is going to be our Lose UI. So just rename that Lose UI. Okay. Both of these at startup need to be turned off. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this one off. See this little checkbox here? Uncheck that. And for Lose UI, rename that to something like Game Over, or You Lose, or whatever you want to communicate to the player so that they know that the game is over. And I'm going to change that from green. I'm going to change it to red. All right, I'm going to turn that object off. And in the future, in another episode, we'll add some scripts to those so that the game can restart gracefully and give the player another shot at it. But for now, let's just go ahead and create those and have those ready. Now let's go back over to the player object. Something about the player I want to mention is that make sure that you're on the player and not the rocket art portion. I like to keep my scripts on a separate object and keep my art on another one. That's so that I can easily change the art without changing all of sort of the scripts for that particular object. And I do intend to change the art for the player ship, so let's not put our scripts on any of these objects. Let's put them all up here. So far we have the move script on the player, but we need a script that's going to lower the fuel amount. So let's add another script to the player. So what you do to add one, just like before, you right click anywhere in an open space here in the Playmaker window and hit add FSM component, and we want new FSM. Now we've got a new one. I want to show you how to switch back and forth between Playmaker scripts. There's this little drop down right here. Right now it says FSM. That's the default name for any new FSM. If you click on that, you'll see that there are two. And see, we can move back and forth between the two. So let's rename this one, the new one we just created. Let's call this one Fuel. Okay, and that's just by clicking on this FSM tab. Back over to state. Now I'm going to switch back off and on again. Yep, now it's renamed Fuel. Okay, so the way this script is going to work is that we're going to listen for the player to press any button. If they move any button that is a move button, like a WASD or an arrow key, we're going to detect that, and then we're going to lower the fuel. And the lowering the fuel is basically just this float number that we created earlier, fuel remaining, and we will lower that. Now, before we lower it, we'll check to see if it's 0. If it's 0, we need to tell the ship to stop moving, to no longer allow it to move, and to basically communicate up here to this UI that it is 0. So let's do that. Let's lay the framework out first. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to listen for any input. So I'm going to just call this like input listener. This one's just going to hang out and listen for the player to press a move button. And then over here, we need another state that is going to be to lower fuel. Again, names don't matter. These are important only for us as human beings, so we know what we were doing. And we need one more state, so just add another state here. Just right-click anywhere in the gray box area and add a state. We need an out of fuel. This is what happens when we run out. Okay, now we need to connect all these. For input listener, I would like there to be one called like, input, right? Input received. I'm going to right click on that, add transition, input. Okay, and then it's going to lower fuel. And on this one, we don't really need a transition out of it, and I'll show you why. We just need a finished one, just a generic. We don't need a custom one, we just use a generic one for finished. And then connect that back to here. And we're not going to connect this one because we want to make sure this happens no matter what. So we're going to say out of fuel. So now on this one, do a global transition. Out of fuel. Yeah. Okay, that's our framework. Now let's add some actions. So over here on fuel, open up your action browser. And here we want access event. Remember before we did get access, that's how we were getting sort of the pressing of the button, and we're storing that as a variable. Now we just really want to know if somebody's pressed something. So do this action here called access event. Okay. And so it's already got the horizontal and vertical written in there for us, but it's also got this thing called any direction. Any direction inputted, we're going to send this event. So if any direction is sent, either from the arrow keys, from the W, A, S, or D key, or a control pad, or whatever the player happens to be using, we will send the message input, and we will move to this state. Okay, so like I said, the first thing we need to do is we need to see if we're at 0, because think about it, if we're at 100, then no problem, we should lower the fuel. But if we had just been at 1 and the player has hit input and we've dropped to 0, we need to know that, because we need to do that before we do anything else. We don't want to lower fuel if we're already at 0. So let's do something called a float compare. A float compare is simply just basically looking at one number and comparing it to another number. In this case, specifically a float number. So the float number we're comparing is fuel, and that's in the globals, right? So find that fuel variable, and the number we want to compare it to is just 0. So if fuel is equal to 0, and this is where that out of fuel transition comes, right? So we want to say if fuel is equal to 0, we want to send out of fuel. And it's not yelling at us right now because we have a global transition hooked up from this. It doesn't actually have to be connected if there's a global transition in the same state. So this is not a problem. Out of fuel. And with floats, it's very, very, very unlikely you will ever get to an even number exactly. So I'm going to go ahead and do if fuel is less than 0. Out of fuel. Okay. After that, I'm going to leave it alone, because it's basically, if it's not 0, we need to do some things. And what things are those? Well, we want to lower fuel. So open up your action browser again. We're going to look for a float subtract. Okay, because we want to lower that fuel number now. All right, so again, the variable that we're looking for is that global fuel variable. And then here's another place where you can balance the game a bit differently than I have. What works for me may not work for you. I did 0.2. You can try whatever number you like. Just the higher the number, the faster the fuel will drain. So the lower the number, the slower it'll drain. So you can adjust difficulty by adjusting this number here. Okay, so now that we've got those two done, we want to send an update to the UI. So we want to let the player know how much fuel is remaining. Thankfully we already set this up when we did this before, so we just need to send a message, right? So we're looking for send event by name. Now it's going to give us some warnings because we need to tell it what we're sending the message to, right? Well, we're not sending it to ourselves. We are sending it to a game object FSM script, and we are not sending this to ourselves. We could, theoretically open up and send it to another event. See, we've got feel and move. We could send another message to a script on this object, but we're not doing that. We want to send it to that UI element. So hit specify game object. Now over here in your canvas, we want to send this to the fuel thing, right? So, but not this top object. Remember, we put the script on this lower one. Now, we want to assign it to this object. The way to do that is left click and drag. Don't let off the mouse until you get over to here. Left click and drag that right in there. Then once you do that, you can hit this little button here. It'll find the script name. We didn't name our script anything, so let's go back and do that real quick. Fuel meter. Let's just call this fuel meter UI. Be really clear with that. Okay, so back on the player object. Now select that fuel meter UI. Excellent. And then the name of the event was called update UI. Just double check that. Yeah, update UI. So this script is waiting to hear a message, and we're going to send it to it, and we're going to say update UI. Anytime the player lowers fuel, anytime they press a button and there's fuel left, it'll come here, it'll compare the float. If it's 0, it'll come to here. If not, it'll do float subtract next. It'll lower by 0.2, and then it will send an event. And then the very last thing it will do is it will leave this state. Finished does that for you. If you leave the state as finished, it's just going to leave. Any other event means that something has to tell it to leave that state with that custom name. So, for example, there's one action in here, and it's called input. If we had put finished on here, it would run that one event and just leave right out of that state. So be careful with finish. Finish is super great for just making it very convenient and not having to do an action to leave. But it means do the actions once and then leave the state. So we don't have to do anything to have this particular state do anything to leave and go back to input listener. If you want to be double sure that it does leave, there's an action called next frame event. You can put that at the very bottom. And so what this is saying is like, hey, no matter what you've done, or up here, as soon as you get to this action, the next thing it should do is it should do this event, right? And so it'll do those 3 actions, and then it will finish with a finish state and leave and go to here. Okay, so that's going to lower the fuel, and then we need to do the out of fuel state. So with out of fuel, we want to disable the player's movement ability. How do we do that? It's really simple. There's an action called enable FSM, right? So at this point, the players run out of fuel. We just want them to not be able to use their movement controls. Well, on the player object, we have that script called move, and we can find that right here. See move. We're just going to disable that, and just like with an activate game object, an unchecked box means that it's disabled. So uncheck that box for move, and now the player will no longer be able to use their thrust ability. And we don't need reset on exit. We can just remove that. And what reset on exit does, just so you know, is that if you had a state, that was connected to this and that was, fueled up, whenever it would leave this state, it would enable the script automatically. That way you wouldn't have to do it with another action. But we'll just leave that. We'll leave that blank. There's one other thing we need to do before we get started testing this one. Let's go to our Playmaker global variables uh, tab there. It's under Playmaker, Editor Windows, Global Variables. And let's adjust that fuel variable. Let's make that 100. If you don't, it's going to be 0 when it first starts out. So we need to put a starting value in there. Just close that when you're done. Okay, let's give it a try. So just go ahead and use up all your fuel. And notice that it's running back and forth here on the state. Getting low. Okay, almost out. And I'm out. Now I think I'm actually still moving. Yeah, I am moving. I'm 7.03 moving. But see, I can no longer move. My arrow keys no longer work. So I'm out of fuel now. And I will drift forever. And that's something we may want to, at some point, consider what we want to do about the game. I currently don't have a solution for that because I left it for you. There's a number of different ways you could fix that, but I wanted to leave some room for you guys to figure this out, how you'd like to how to address that. And that's it for this tutorial. Next time we'll do landing pads and we'll have a working game.